Now, inspired by her faith, she said, this is an example of premature forgiveness again, which I think is sort of in a way the dark side of forgiveness. It can come too quickly and it can become motivated by faith and not always helpful. Anyway, she said that she said, I hadn't actually forgiven. Early on, she spoke of forgiving the man who killed her son, but then she said, I hadn't actually forgiven. The root of bitterness ran deep. Anger had set in and I hated everyone. I remained like this for years, driving many people away. There's another example. I mean, premature forgiveness, or should we say instant forgiveness, can really exasperate people and confuse people. When Dylan Roof walked into a Charleston church in America, murdering 9 African Americans, within days, some family members were talking about forgiveness. And while that was deeply inspirational to many, it also caused a lot of contention and debate online, where people were asking, does Black forgiveness condone white violence? And it was, you know, an interesting debate, and it raised a lot of questions, I think. There also has been a study into domestic violence, not surprising in a way, that forgiving those who abuse you just encourages more abuse. But also, I'd like to bring in what Desmond Tutu has written a lot about forgiveness. And I like what he says here. He says, don't be a masochist. You can forgive and release a relationship, or you can forgive and renew a relationship. So you don't have to stick with and think that you can change people that are hurting you. Also, just to address the forgive and forget element to the title of this talk, I think where hurts and traumas are so deep, obviously you do never forget. They are in and part of your life. But what does happen, and people have told me this for something like a couple of mothers whose daughters were murdered, both said the same thing to me. They said as they began to explore the journey of forgiveness, line themselves up for forgiveness, one of them meeting the man who killed her daughter, they thought less about what had happened. And they thought less about their child, and they felt that they were betraying their child because of that. Although that is all part of the letting go and the rumination, letting go of thoughts that can actually grind you to a full stop and a halt. So that was interesting. Also, I think where small things happen with friends and relatives. I mean, the other day I was thinking about a friend of mine I had a fight with. I don't know what happened 20 years ago. I cannot tell you now what it was that we were fighting about. So I think that's absolutely right. Forgive and forget. If I could remember every detail of that fight 20 years ago, well, I probably wouldn't have forgiven, or she wouldn't have forgiven me, whatever it is. And that, yeah, it's worth saying, actually, forgiveness can also be an act of aggression. If you both feel that you're right, and you sort of have it out and you move on, but the next day one person says to the other, oh, by the way, I just want you to know I forgive you. You know, it'll bring up the anger all over again, because it can be, saying I forgive you can be an act of aggression. So what I want to do now, just to sort of conclude really in the last bit, is just talk about the process, how I talk about the process of forgiveness. Looking at what does it take to live in peace with those we fear or those who've hurt us? What does it take to restore relationships, or if that's impossible, to reconcile with our own unresolved pain? What does it take to forgive? And I've identified 4 sort of fundamental human qualities, which can help people line themselves up to forgive. So the first one is curiosity. Curiosity, I think, is a vital ingredient to forgive, because it fuels an inquiring, open mind as you move from why me to why then. wonder and curiosity keep us, I think, all from behaving as if we have everything figured out. And it's a recognition that we don't have the full story. And the example, and the person I want to introduce you to illustrate this point is another storyteller for the Forgiveness Project. His name's Carsten Mathiasen. He's Danish. He's a clown, actually, a professional clown for many years. And his story, I didn't know his personal story till quite recently when he told me, and I collected it for the Forgiveness Project. And it's a story about how his wife, much younger, 2 young children, his wife leaves him. Sorrow soon turned to fury at this. His rival was called Torben. Carsten would ring Torben on the phone and scream abuse, threatening violence. He was tormented and obsessed, threatening all the time, not doing anything, but angry. And until one day his daughter sort of prompted him to think differently. She said what a nice guy Torben was. And by now he'd realized he wasn't going to get his wife back, and he wanted to restore relationships. And he decided to reach out. And the next time he called him, he invited Torben for a coffee. He wanted to know what this guy was like. He had the curiosity, the bigger vision. And he said, when I saw this man come through the door, I found him handsome and friendly, had a gypsy-like appearance, which I liked. I knew from that moment on that we would become friends. And they did. They became really good friends for years, until Torben developed cancer and terminal cancer. And Carsten visited him in the hospice, and Carsten was one of the last people to visit him. And he said to me, when Torben went out of my world and died, I cried the way I did when he came into it. So the second quality is perspective. Having curiosity means you develop an open mind, which leads to having a broader perspective and worldview. Forgivers tend to be very flexible thinking, flexible thinkers, far-reaching thinkers who seek to understand others. They're not black and white thinkers. They have this wide-angle view on life. And this is Jill Hicks. She's actually another one who doesn't like to use the word forgiveness, but her story is, imbued with compassion and empathy. Now, Jill was in the 2005 London bombs, and she lost both her legs in one of the tube trains. And she became, as a result, what she called a reluctant peace activist. Reluctant in the sense that she never chose or wanted to be in this position. But in the pitch black of the bombed carriage, she made a vow to herself and to the world that she would honor life by trying to live without hatred. It was a pledge, really, that the violence ends with me, the hate ends with me. And so all her work has been about reaching out and talking to people with different views and starting peace organizations. And she gets a lot of hate online because people like her shouldn't be saying that. And her drive has always been to understand. And even though she says she'll never be able to really understand why someone she never had met hated her so much that they wanted to kill her. She does say this. She says, I could never have imagined that a 19-year-old suicide bomber would actually teach me a valuable lesson. He taught me to never presume anything about anyone you don't know. So this broadening perspective leads to rehumanizing the other as opposed to demonizing the other. Empathy. So if curiosity leads to understanding, still quite rational, then understanding leads to empathy, which is more heart-based. And it requires you to stand in someone else's shoes, no matter how dirty or ill-fitting those shoes may be. Often I've found that it's a moment of empathy that shifts the narrative from hate. And this is Grace Idua. She lives in London. Behind her is her husband. In 2008, her adored middle son, David, was murdered in a random attack in London by a boy from another school. He was called Elijah. He was quickly sentenced and imprisoned. And for a long time, Grace felt nothing but rage and anger and just utter crippling despair, until, exhausted and overwhelmed with the grief, she decided that she needed to ask Elijah why he'd done it. It was something she had never been able to get her head around. So a meeting was arranged, a restorative justice meeting, which is the meeting of a victim and offender, in Ashfield Young Offenders Institute. She went down to Bristol, where it was then, and she arrived. And when she arrived at the prison, she was told that the meeting had very, very nearly been cancelled because Elijah had been up all night, was anxious, and had been crying. But it went ahead. There was a chaplain, there was a prison officer. And when she went in, one of the first questions she asked Elijah at this very tense meeting was, why had he killed David? And he told her that he had done it because David was from a rival school and because he happened to have a knife in his pocket that day. And when she heard this, the banality of this, she collapsed in tears. She said to me she never cried in front of strangers. Very proud woman, never cried in front of strangers before. And then when she recovered herself, she said, when I recovered myself, I told Elijah, I'm not crying for David, I'm crying for you. What have you done with your life? And so I think this is a true moment of empathy, and it led Grace and her family to really helping them in their recovery, because she asked Elijah to write to her two other sons to explain what had happened, to articulate his remorse to them, and it really helped them move on so that they were able to break the cycle of hate. And she talks of having forgiven Elijah for what he's done. The last one is letting go of resentment and relinquishing hatred, sort of key in a way. And I think this means giving up your hard-won sense of power, including the power of being morally superior or the position of being right, or righteous anger. It means giving up all the payoffs that come with the victim position. Brené Brown said an interesting thing. She said she spent a long time thinking about what forgiveness was, and she couldn't understand why it wasn't complete and whole in her work until she realized that forgiveness was all about grief. She said the reason why forgiveness is so hard is that in order for us to forgive, something has to die, and we have to grieve something that is lost, whether it's a relationship or whether it is, as I say, this hard-won sense of power. This is Bassam Aramin, and Bassam is from the West Bank. At 16, he tried to blow up Israeli military, and he was sentenced to 7 years in prison. And it was during this time that he was shown a film about the Holocaust, and he says that he didn't really believe, he thought the Holocaust was a myth, and he was quite keen to see the film because he wanted to see Jews suffer, and he thought he enjoyed seeing the film. But seeing the film utterly changed him, and he started to break down crying. He said it was the first time he felt some empathy towards his oppressors, and it was the beginning, a sort of seed of change that led to him becoming friends with one of the guards, and led to him, when he was eventually released, to founding an organisation called Combatants for Peace, which is an organisation where former combatants and fighters on both sides, Israeli and Palestinian sides, work together for peace. And he did this for some years, and it's extraordinary that he's still doing it, because then after that, his daughter Amir, one of his children, was killed outside her school, shot by an Israeli soldier. And you'd expect that he would have given up his work, but no, he carried on even stronger than ever. And he said, for me, there was no return from non-violence. After all, it was one Israeli soldier who shot my daughter, but 100 former Israeli soldiers who built a garden in her name. At the school where she was murdered. So I should add, of those 4 qualities, I think self-reflection is a really important aspect as well. Just everyone I've met has spent a long time of looking inwards, doing work on themselves in order to be more productive members of society and be able to give back. All those I've met sort of understand that if we don't do that, we become, or any of us can become deluded and create more damage. So forgiveness is really a pain management strategy in that way. And I really like this. I'm just going to end with 2 quotes that sort of me sum up in a way why people do this work, because it is work. And one is one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin. He says, "I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with their pain." And then the last quote is by the Franciscan author, Richard Rohr, who's very popular also with secularists. And he says, "If we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it." So I think, as I've implied, the Forgiveness Project does not give people processes or means in which to forgive, because people do sometimes ask, how can I forgive? You know, there are courses out there, you can go on courses, but all I really want to do is to ask people to consider this through stories. So to create a place of inquiry and exploration and examination through how, and look at how others have done it, because as a journalist, I know totally, and I understand the power of story. And stories can amplify hate and they can normalize prejudice. But stories can also act as a great force for good in the world. And I suppose what the Forgiveness Project is doing is trying to nudge the narrative of our day, which is so focused, I think, at the moment on hate, insularity, and division, to nudge it towards empathy, compassion, and forgiveness. So I hope I haven't over-talked.
Not at all.
I shall stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Marina. I'm hoping that I haven't lost Matt, because he is definitely the one who's sorting the next bit out.
Yeah, don't worry, I'm here, Chrissy. So,
oh, good, I couldn't see you.
So hopefully you can see my screen there. Once again, with the page for the questions, please go to slido/forgive, sli.do/forgive, enter your questions there, and then after the break, we'll get into them.
Excellent, thank you. So go and pour yourselves a drink, write some questions, and come back in 10 minutes, or a bit less actually, at 8:30. Okay, thanks everyone. Don't go far. Asking the questions. Are you happy to do that, Matt? Otherwise I've got them also.
Yeah, I can go ahead.
Okay.
I think generally we like to obviously ask the questions which are most upvoted. In this case, there's a lot of questions which have the same number of votes. So I think what I'll do is start with those from named contributors and then move on to some of the anonymous ones. So the first one, Marina, is from Grace. And she asks, "I once heard that all forgiveness is self-forgiveness, forgiveness for not having stopped something happening, believing you deserved it, etc. What are your thoughts on this?"
Self-forgiveness, I think, is self-compassion. And I think there's some truth in that if we do not have compassion for ourselves, it's harder to have it for others. So I think it's all tied up. I mean, I don't like to make sweeping statements about what forgiveness is and forgiveness isn't, as I probably made quite clear. But I think it's an interesting thought. And I think self-forgiveness is also probably possibly the most difficult form of forgiveness, because we're tough on ourselves. And from all the interviews that I've done with people, the greatest pain that I've experienced with being with people is among those who cannot forgive themselves and are completely stuck with self-hatred and regret, and it keeps them, tied to their pain. So I think probably it's a fairly wise statement that you said.
Okay, Paul asks, do you have any stories of anyone who has thrived through not forgiving and has improved the world through it? So Paul wants to ask about the contrary.
Well, I only know in the sense that that's not what the Forgiveness Project does. And it depends. When you say not forgiving, do you mean hating, or do you mean just not forgiving? Because clearly there are so many different opinions about what forgiveness is and what it means. And there are a couple of people that I've shared with you who do not use the word forgiveness and say they do not forgive, and yet they have thrived, and they're extremely compassionate, open, broad-minded people. But they probably see forgiveness as meaning condoning and excusing. That's their it's not my definition of what forgiveness is, but it may well be theirs, and therefore they don't want to forgive. But but if you mean, have I seen people thrive who sort of are full of hate and revenge and bitterness and etc.? I haven't, and I don't look for them.
Is it possibly the case that we don't have a good word in the English language for the type of forgiveness that you've been describing, Marina? And so
yeah, I'm not even sure, that it's forgiveness and related concepts, isn't it? I mean, it's because some people would say, some people do, and there's books written about it, say forgiveness is dependent on remorse and apology and change of the offender, and that what I've been describing quite a lot here isn't forgiveness at all. But people describe it as forgiveness, and I think people know what it means to them, and it does mean a kind of relinquishing and releasing of the blame and the fear and the hate that you may have felt, but is now dissipated and disappearing. So there's a change. But this is why it's such a exasperating subject in a way, slippery.
Yeah. Okay. Andy asks, if forgiveness is both to help yourself deal with pain and a way of investing in the future of your community, can you have one without the other?
I think the personal and the collective are linked. I mean, I think if you deal with your own trauma and pain, you're going to operate better in the world. And I think, because you can think of forgiveness as an entirely sort of interpersonal and personal process that is just about self-reflection and about being a better person, or a happier person, I should say. But of course, we're all linked to each other, and I find it interesting. I don't think you can't legislate, obviously, to forgiveness. They did say that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I spoke to someone who was part of one of the architects of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who said at one point they'd considered making forgiveness mandatory. And then he said, we came to our senses very quickly and realized that that would be impossible. And of course it is. But there are processes in Sierra Leone. There's forgiveness ceremonies that go on in villages where former perpetrators are coming back to live next to neighbors that they had harmed and hurt and maybe killed. And they have rituals of forgiveness that helps societies, rebuild and mend. Well, I can't imagine us doing that here.
No. Derek asks, I'm unhappy about our courts encouraging victims to contribute with impact statements. I feel these are often revenge actions. What thoughts have you on this?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think victims need their say in court. Victims feel very often left out of the whole criminal justice system. It is their one time to say what they feel. I think that's probably true, that a lot of it is revenge, but equally I've heard some amazing victim impact statements. There was one that just came out of Christchurch. A Muslim woman was talking, she was interviewed on Radio 4, so I didn't hear the whole victim impact statement, but she said during it, she slightly shifted it. He was standing in court, the man who killed all those people, and she suddenly started talking about forgiveness because that was what her faith called her to. And what was touching was apparently the officer came up to her afterwards and said that he'd seen the face of the perpetrator, who had for the first time in the whole of the hearings shown emotion. So it actually really got through to him. But that was not a victim, that was not a statement full of revenge. But I mean, I think you have a point, whoever made that point.
Okay, Andy says, concepts like this, overcoming fear, living your dreams, etc., are often talked about with extreme cases. Should we focus more on small daily acts of forgiveness?
Yes, definitely. I think we should. I mean, as a journalist, I sought out stories that would grab attention, obviously, the bigger stories of forgiveness. But I'm well aware that sometimes it's the smaller wrongs of loved ones that are more difficult to forgive than the bigger wrongs of strangers, and that we all are dealing with feelings of hurt in our own lives all the time, and that it can become very debilitating. And I know lots of cases, I'm sure we all do, of people not speaking to people, families falling out over things that are said or haven't been said. And I think, forgiveness does play a really important role. As I quoted the poet and philosopher David White, who says, all friendships or intimate relationships of any length are based on continued and mutual forgiveness, because that's how they continue, by us forgiving others and being forgiven by others.
Okay, so getting into some of the anonymous questions now. How does one go about, I mean, you touched on this in many ways already, but how does one go about forgiving oneself for sins of the past?
I mean, I think, the first sort of step to forgiving yourself or others is to want to line yourself up for it, to explore the possibility. And then it's an individual journey. I'll just take one example of someone this isn't forgiving themselves, but she had to forgive, she's actually forgiven a young man who raped her when she was very young, but it took decades. And she'd written a book called Unbroken. And in the book, it's useful in the sense of healing, because she goes through everything that she did, and she did endless different therapies and reading and walking, and slowly, bit by bit, she healed herself through this long and intense journey of self-discovery. And I think sometimes just doing it, taking the action, explore, you don't know where it's going to lead, but change is difficult, and forgiveness is part of a change process.
Next one is also something that you've touched on a lot, but I will ask, what is the biggest misconception about forgiveness you find?
The biggest one, I suppose that it means condoning and excusing and rewarding bad behavior. I mean, I just jotted down this quote today, which I think sort of sums up the sort of anti-forgiveness line, really. It's from a couple of academics, and they said, to forgive without requiring the other to change is not only self-destructive, but ensures a dysfunctional relationship will remain so by continually rewarding mistreatment. That goes back to what Desmond Tutu said, you know, forgive and renew, or forgive and release, get out of there, but don't walk away filled with hate. But I suppose the biggest misconception really is that I think that that's all it means. What that statement says, that's all it means. And it can mean that, but it means much, much more.
Next one is not a question, but someone passing on their thoughts that this is probably the best Bristol Humanist talk they've attended. Thanks for moving and informative, so thank you.
Appreciate that.
Among the stories of the Forgiveness Project, are most in the unconditional category or the conditional category? It's one more.
Well, yeah, interesting. I think most are in the unconditional, but not all. But there are many restorative justice actually stories up there, and all of them, the forgiveness has been sparked. They didn't go into restorative justice to meet the offender, meet the victim or the victim offender. And forgiveness should never be, you know, a requirement of restorative justice, but in all the stories that I've collected, it has been an outcome. So there are many of those stories, but I think a great deal it's self-preservation and it's self-healing, because there is no chance of any kind of reconciliation or relationship with the person who's harmed or hurt you. So that these people see forgiveness as a way through, a way of turning the page, a way of letting go of those thoughts that are crippling. Yeah.
And in your travels, Marina, have you found any cultures or countries which are particularly, quote unquote, good at forgiveness, or able to approach the state in a well-adjusted way?
Yes, and well, I should say that I haven't done enough travel. When I said I travel, I did. I went to Israel, I went to Palestine, I went to South Africa and Northern Ireland and America and India, you know, so it's not a great, but I would say that places like India and the East, they're much more comfortable thinking in terms of compassion and empathy. The African Christian countries and communities, again, it's part of their culture. It's the point that they go to quickly. Sometimes no, actually, in Africa, I always felt it was completely genuine. When I say genuine, I was going to say it feels completely genuine. It's not always genuine, but it's like the story that I gave of Mary Johnson, where people feel their faith calls them to forgive. They want to, it's sincere, it's genuine, but it takes time and it's a process. And very often people actually haven't forgiven when they say they do, they have. So I've digressed a bit on that one, but I think we in the West, particularly in this country, I don't think we feel very comfortable with the notion of forgiveness.
Have you any theories on why that might be?
No, not really. I think we're quite skeptical people, and I think we're quite reserved people. I'm talking about the UK. And it's not part of it's not a subject people feel comfortable with. I have people feeling, you know, people get very angry about it. That's why I very much frame the Forgiveness Project around a place of inquiry and exploration and discussion and conversation. I would feel so uncomfortable, well, I wouldn't be able to do it, to create an organization that was just trying to persuade people that they must forgive. And there are quite a few organizations like that. They're all in America, actually, and I'm sure other places, but there's very little in this country that specifically looks at forgiveness.
Okay, I'm going to scroll down a little here. Have you met any young storytellers? I'm interested to know about forgiveness as a skill across generations?
Oh, you know, this is a big, in a way, a big lacking in the Forgiveness Project. We have very few young storytellers, although we meet many young people, work with young people who all have interesting things to say about forgiveness and the experiences. But in terms of what we're doing in presenting, in a way, big stories that also can resonate within the smaller stories, because the process is so long, it does mean that our storytellers are skewed to the
Right, of course,
35 plus, I would say. But
yeah.
I have to stress that the Forgiveness Project, you know, it's not a scientifically chosen group of people. It's flawed. It's not it's not well researched in that respect, because it's founded by a single person, me, getting the stories together, you know, creating an organization when I've been a freelance journalist for 20 years, becoming a charity, working with more people. People constantly say, can we share our stories with you? And we, you know, sometimes we say yes, sometimes we have to say no, for different reasons. But it means that it's not, it's lacking in some respect. And one of the ways that it's lacking is that we don't have enough young people. It's not good.
Okay, this is another one where perhaps you mentioned a couple of cases where this was the case, but perhaps you could elaborate a little. Have you seen instances where unsolicited forgiveness has a positive effect on the perpetrator?
Yes, unsolicited. Yes, I can give an example of that, actually. So Anna Michaelis is, I mean, many of the stories actually start from when people were very young. But the trouble is, once we get to the forgiveness, they've got a bit older. So Arno is like a guy in his early 40s, and he's covered in tattoos, and he's a former white supremacist from America, responsible for a huge amount of violence when he was younger. And one of the reasons he changed, he had tattoos of swastikas on his knuckles. And one of the things that caused him to change his mind about the way his life was going was when he went into a McDonald's, and there was a African-American woman serving him, and he brandished his knuckles at her. And instead of her responding like he expected and like people normally did, she just looked at him with, you know, a huge amount of sort of compassion. And she said to him, you know, you're worth more than that. And he was so taken aback by this display of compassion, forgiveness, you might say, that he sort of fled from McDonald's, never to go back in there again. But he said it was the unconditional forgiveness of people I once hated that had allowed me to move from where I was to where I am now. And he started an organization called Life After Hate, and wow, he does absolutely brilliant work with young people in schools now.
This is actually my question. It seems that this is, as you said, anything that involves personal change is usually requires a lot of hard work and time. So is achieving a state of forgiveness, you know, is it possible this is something that you could work for a very long time towards and not achieve? Have you found those instances like that? I don't, I hate to
Well, it can change. I mean, one day you can forgive and the next day you can be triggered or reminded, or something else comes up and you're back where you were. I mean, that's unfortunately life, but maybe you aren't back quite so far where you are. But I think if people really want to get through something and forgive someone who's harmed them or hurt them, and they're absolutely determined to do it, they will do it. But I think it's really important to just remember it's not a static thing, it's a fluid thing, it's a process, it's, you know, and it's about just being kind to yourself as well, because it's quite unusual to actually, it's not a destination, you know, it's been said too often, this, you know, it's a journey, not a destination, but it's very true about forgiveness.
In terms of that, like one day you may be in this state of forgiveness, and then the next day you may have a trigger, and you have a different state. I can imagine that being problematic in personal relationships, where someone says, "Okay,
Yeah.
I'm now at the point where I forgive you for this thing you did before," but then maybe a few days later or a week later, it comes up.
Yeah, with personal relationships, I think it would be problematic. And it would mean something else was going on, I think. But I do know of, I can think of at least 2 couples that I know where one of them has had an affair and been unfaithful, but they're still together, you know, and the affair has come to an end. And well, I think in one particular where she clearly has not forgiven him, because she is sniping at him all the time and undermining him, and, you know, she says she has got over it, but it's clear that she hasn't. And I think it's understandable. It's understandable, but at the same time, it makes for a very unhappy relationship.
You mentioned earlier in the talk, Marina, that sometimes saying "I forgive you" can actually be an aggressive statement, which I think everyone sort of realized what you were getting at there, and have sort of seen that in action.
Yeah.
So should one avoid that exact phrase altogether?
Well, I think if you both feel that you know, often we know that when we've hurt somebody or been hurt by someone, it's often quite clear about who has been wronged and harmed. But when you both have very strong opinions about being right, if you like, then I don't think forgiveness is useful, because it just puts one above the other.
Yeah.
I think compassion is probably better, and just moving on and understanding and acceptance. You know, there's a much better, you know, emotions to work with, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll just have a couple more here as we approach 9 o'clock. There seems to be a lot in common with certain Buddhist concepts. I think you mentioned a Zulu tradition or something like that, but letting go of attachment, or just letting go in general, is a very Buddhist thing. And then, of course, compassion is quite a Buddhist thing. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, it does. It really does. And I think one of the Buddhist writers, one of the Rinpoche, and I can't remember which one, sort of said, you say nothing. Let me just see if I've got it here. I just had it up. Yeah, it's Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. Anyway, he's written a book, and he says, as anyone in the hell of hatred knows, nothing binds you to the object of hatred more than your own aversion. I thought that was so true. You know, the more you think about the person that you hate, the more you're locked together. That's a very Buddhist concept, and the whole idea of the Buddhist concept of suffering being clinging to that which changes, you know, that just accepting the fluidity of life, and that we can't control life. And, you know, this goes back to what I was saying about forgiving personalities. They're not black and white thinkers, they're flexible thinkers. They know that good people do bad things, and bad things happen to good people, and that life is morally complicated, and the mindset.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll have one more question as we're humanists. Maybe this is the appropriate question to ask end on. What are some differences and similarities between religious approaches to forgiveness and those demonstrated by secular individuals or organizations, perhaps?
So this is the sort of question where I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask. I'm going to be honest with you, because I don't know really enough about all the different ways that religions talk about forgiveness. I do know that in the Jewish faith, they talk very much about reparation, and it is conditional forgiveness. I know that Buddhism talks more about compassion. that Islam talks more about peace, but all of them talk about, even within the Christian faith, there are the camp, the conditional forgiveness and the unconditional forgiveness camp. So there's no right or wrong. I think the only thing I would say is that I said earlier that we get asked, people want to share their stories with the Forgiveness Project, and often we say politely that we can't, we can't do that. And very often it's because their stories have come from a very strong religious standpoint. And the reason why we have one or two like that, but I don't want people to feel that forgiveness is just about having a religious faith. And I think that's what those stories do, and they're exclusive and not, and from my point of view, they're not helpful from the Forgiveness Project point of view.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. Marina, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Marina. That was so good. Thank you.
Thank you all of you for coming and for listening. Well, it was lovely being with you all. I appreciate it.
Good. That's lovely. Well, thank you very much. And please, everybody, come to our next Bristol Humanists meeting on October the 5th, and keep an eye on what we're up to on our Facebook page and meetup page. So lovely. Thank you all for coming, and bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.